Welcome to the Division of Local Services webinar relative to the role of the collector. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer McAllister, and I support training initiatives here at DLS. As many of you know, DLS promotes sound municipal financial management practices and supports local officials by providing guidance, training, and oversight. Before we get started, I want to remind participants that this webinar will be recorded and posted on the DLS YouTube channel for future reference. The webinar, PowerPoint presentation, and any links highlighted during the webinar will be shared with you later this week. And if you're going to submit any questions you have, please use the Q&A function in the menu bar, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce David Guzman from the Bureau of Accounts and Casey Vick from the Financial Management Resource Bureau to give an overview of the role of the collector, and David will kick it off.
Good morning. Just wanted to thank everyone for attending our webinar today. Today, as Jen has just told you, we'll be talking about the role of the collector. Next slide, please. Okay, so basically there are two types of collectors. There's a tax collector and there's a city or town collector. The tax collector possesses the authority to collect any real personal property taxes, excise, betterments, and certain other charges added to and committed as taxes. The city or town collector has expanded authority to receive all monies and accounts due to a municipality. There is a local acceptance statute that must be adopted by the municipality. An example of this would be water and sewer user fees, trash collection fees, etc. Thank you. Next slide, please. Some of the responsibilities of the collector we'll be talking about in these couple slides are commitments and tax bills. The collector is responsible for sending a tax bill to each person assessed, resident or non-resident, upon receiving the tax commitment list and warrant duly and properly signed by the assessors. The collector must furnish a fidelity bond for the collector and any appropriate staff with sureties payable to the city, town, or district. And this is done sort of like an insurance policy for the city or town in case something negative were to happen in that office. The collector must establish procedures for daily collection, posting, and the deposit of funds collected. You also conduct a visual spot check of printed bills prior to the mailing to ensure completeness and accuracy of the information. And this particular step is super important. You don't want bills to go out with the wrong information. It's just not a good look. You're going to get tons of calls with people asking about the errors. The collector, you must ensure compliance with bill form prescribed by the commissioner. You submit an affidavit as to the time of sending tax bills as evidence of bill mail date and retain a copy with the commitment book. Next slide, please. Some other responsibilities of the collector are collections and reconciliations. Okay, you have to maintain a manual or electronic tax commitment list showing the status of taxpayer accounts. You pay over to the treasurer at least once a week all monies received along with the detailed report of all charges and fees collected. I always found that the more you do this, the easier it is to find mistakes or anything that didn't go your way. You must maintain a receivable control or cash book that records outstanding taxes due at the start of each month with downward adjustments for collections, abatements, and exemptions, and upward adjustments for refunds. You reconcile each month the daily deposits and turnovers to the treasurer, also at least quarterly outstanding balances with the accountant and auditor's records. And this again, I always found that the more you do this, the easier it is to find mistakes. You establish procedures for sending tax demands, initiating tax takings, reporting bounce checks to the auditor and accountant, generating municipal lien certificates, and also processing refunds. Next slide, please. Okay, you may appoint a deputy collector to act as an agent of the collector. They shall have the same powers of the collector, and they also must maintain a performance bond no less than the minimum set by the commissioner. You have to ensure that the deputy turns over at least once a week all monies received, along with an itemized report of all taxes and excises collected. Also may issue demands and warrants to the deputy collector, authorizing them to collect on delinquent taxes or excises. And this is where the fun starts for collectors. This is where you're going to get a ton of calls from folks that are upset that they receive demands or warrants and you're charging them an extra fee. Next slide, please. The tax title process begins with the collector sending demands, requesting payment for unpaid taxes. If taxes remain unpaid, the collector secures a municipal lien on the property for unpaid taxes. The responsibility then transfers to the treasurer for maintenance and collection of tax title accounts. The treasurer files a foreclosure petition if payment is not received. Now, Casey will talk. Casey is going to take over the presentation from here.
Thank you so much, Dave. So I won't go into too much into tax title because I'm sure you're aware that tax title can be very complicated and also has its own timing structure and legal requirements. But I think it's important for our collectors to understand that tax title is not secured until the collector completes the taking process, which culminates in the recording of the instrument of taking. So while a collector has flexibility in when this process is completed, there's a definitive time limit to secure the city or town's lien on the property. The issuing of taxes is an automatic statutory lien as of January 1st of the year of assessment. And this automatic lien continues for 5 years after this January 1st assessment date or 3.5 years from the end of the fiscal year of the tax assessment. But a city or town lien on property is not perfected or secured until an instrument of taking has been recorded. So most collectors complete this tax taking process well within this time frame, but it's good to remember that there is a time limitation to perfecting that lien and that process. Next slide, please. So with the time limitations we just mentioned, it's important to talk about the policy decisions available to collectors and how to institute best practice. So a big question around tax title is how aggressive should collectors be in securing the liens? And it's a hard question because it can depend on what works for your community and also the different perspectives that individuals can have. Legally speaking, a collector has every ability to move an unpaid real estate bill into tax title before the end of the fiscal year. So if you're strict with your timings and you forego the optional notices, the legal requirements for demands, advertising, and tax taking can absolutely be completed in this time frame. And some collectors do this and it works for them. Other collectors choose to wait, give taxpayers more time to pay off the delinquent real estate. They send out optional notices and they try to get more people to come in and pay off the balances before it moves into the tax title category. Personally, during my time as collector treasurer, I would aim for a September-October timeframe after the fiscal year is completed for my tax title. I would send the demands in May, and I would personally use the months of June and July to do the prep work, send out optional letters, try to encourage people to come in and pay off the balances. And ultimately, for those that didn't pay off the balances, have those recordings or have those takings recorded by the fall. But again, it's what works for your community and what works for you and your staffing levels and your office structure. Another policy choice is payments agreements. Now, we won't go into depth on payment agreements because it is the responsibility of the treasurer rather than the collector. But I mention it because there are policy decisions around payment agreements. For example, if your community has adopted Mass General Law, Chapter 60, Section 62A, the treasurer has the authority to waive up to 50% of interest accrued on a tax title account. But again, this section of the law grants the authority, but it does not require the treasurer to waive any tax title interest at all. And this brings us to best practices around tax title. The first and foremost is consistency. The more consistent you are with timing your process, the more taxpayers will understand how long they really have to pay off their taxes before it becomes a lien. So pick a time frame that works for you and year after year, stick to it as best you can. And consistency in policies, it also helps avoid accusations or perception of favoritism. So say you're a combined collector treasurer and you waive 20% 25% interest on one tax sale account, but none on another. If there's no policy supporting why that decision was made, it can confuse taxpayers and make them feel like you're playing favorites. Also, a best practice is to secure tax liens before any discussion of payment agreements occurs. And this goes back to what we talked about earlier regarding the time frame for perfecting the lien. So I would encourage best practice to be perfecting the lien, securing the tax taking, and then if you choose to have a payment agreement with that taxpayer pay it off, you've secured the municipality's lien and their claim on that unpaid tax, and you can move forward with a payment agreement in. Next, please. And we've already been speaking about collector and treasurer responsibilities, so we can talk about the relationship between the two. So Mass General Law permits the consolidation of these positions. So, and a separate or combined collector and treasurer is really a policy choice for a municipality. And as a community changes over time, the separation or combination of the roles can change with it. But there's a lot of factors that can drive the decision to have a separate or combined role. Factors like population, staffing levels, municipal services offered, and the structure of your city or town hall. Some processes can be streamlined with a combined role, like the tax title process we were talking about. And having one person fill a combined role can also help communities within the financial team or with community members because they can help communications because, again, there's one person instead of two. But the catch-22 of the combined role is that it requires more expertise because it encompasses a greater range of responsibility. And this can be a difficult role to fill, especially if communities are struggling to either find qualified individuals or afford to pay for a combined role in that expertise. Next. I just want to briefly mention some trends that we see across the Commonwealth. As time goes on, we're seeing a move away from elected roles in favor of appointed positions, whether it's a standalone collector or a combined collector treasurer. That trend is sticking. And we also see a large number of combined roles. Over 80% of municipalities have a combined collector treasurer position. And there's a few factors we often see in municipalities that are making changes to their collector position or their collector office. A lot of changes occur when there is a vacancy in the office or if there's a planned retirement. For example, if there's a longtime elected collector retiring and they are supporting a change to make their office appointed, or maybe a community has a collector, but there's a vacancy in the treasurer position, and now there's support and an incentive for that municipality to formally combine the role. A lot of changes can be proposed when a municipality is going through a charter adoption or review process. And those kind of processes can really push people to look at their city or town structure and include changes to the collector's office when they're reorganizing or trying to modernize their community. And sometimes these conversions happen simultaneously, and there's support to change from a separately elected collector and treasurer and to change into a combined appointed role. So different factors, but those are some of the ones that we see happening more often or occurring a lot when municipalities are making these changes. Next. So regardless of elected or appointed or separate or combined, the collector is an important part of the municipality's financial team. They support internal operations with regular reconciliations with Treasury and accounting offices. They coordinate with the assessing offices on things like tax and excise billing. And they facilitate communications between taxpayers and other financial offices. Excise abatements are a great example of this. If a customer comes in, they're usually coming to the collector's window to inquire about a bill they have for a vehicle that maybe they no longer have. And it's helpful to facilitate those communications of helping a taxpayer say, you have to speak to the assessors and, translate to them how it works and what will happen to their bill and what you can do to support them and make that process go smooth. Their knowledge and work also supports financial team goals and objectives. They provide revenue collection reports, outstanding receivable records, and they know the timing of bill collections and the cash flow being brought in. Next. So it's important for that a collector is collaborative with other financial team members and other department heads. This is, their role in the financial management team is important, but they also have to be collaborative with other members so that things work easier and that the team is supported in every aspect. They should be involved in the financial team and supportive of coordinated team projects and goals. And the collector can also be the liaison between the municipality and the taxpayer. The collector's office is one of the departments with the most public interaction. So knowing your community and residents can support public relations and help translate some difficult financial conversations or complexities. So again, going back to tax title, if a resident comes in and they're late with their real estate and they're worried about losing their house, a good collector can have that conversation about tax title and what the process is. Maybe they can ease some of the fear of that resident. They can have a conversation that explains the collection process and its timing and help the resident figure out how and when they need to have that bill paid off before they have a lien secured on their property. Next. And finally, we should understand what a collector should be to a community. Be consistent with your policies and practices. Residents won't always be happy with your rules, but they should feel that the rules for them are the same for everyone else. And consistency builds trust. Trust in your decisions, in your policies, in your approach, and your fairness to residents. And a collector can be, again, we go back to the taxpayer perspective, a collector can be a financial translator for residents, help taxpayers understand the intricate and confusing parts of municipal government. Even something like being able to explain why someone's November tax bill is different than a February bill. That sort of information may be second nature to a collector or collection office staff, but it's not always common knowledge for residents, especially maybe someone that's just moved to Massachusetts or this is a first-time homeowner. So a collector is a very important part of the community and it should never be underestimated what they can provide not only to the financial team, but also to the residents and their taxpayers. Next. So thank you for listening to our presentation, and I'm going to turn this over back to Deb for moderating of the question and answer section.
Thanks, Casey. So somebody asked initially what the citation is in Mass General Law for the requirement for bonding to receive taxpayers. And so I dropped that reference into the Q&A, and it's Mass General Law, Chapter 60, Section 13. That's the first question. Krishan is asking Casey and Dave, for jurisdictions having a combined treasurer collector, is it required to have a separate set of books and banks for collector?
I would say, you know, I'm not aware of any requirement for that. I would say that's kind of the bonus of having combined collector treasurer role, is that it streamlines the process because it's one combined office. You know, it translates different ways, but you know, your requirements are, you know, you're having a record of what you're collecting, of what's being you know, turned over to the treasury side, which even though you are the treasurer, you know, you're having a record of what's being deposited in the bank. You have your cash book being reconciled, and also reconciling with the accountant. So it gets a little bit more seamless because it's the same person doing these same reconciliations instead of transitioning them from one separate office to the other. But it's the same requirements needed, whether you're the same requirements in essence. It just looks a little bit differently because you have one person instead of two.
Yeah, and you know, from the accounting perspective, I would say in Mass General Law, it calls out the instances where funds need to be kept in a separate bank account. So generally that's not the case, but Mass General Law will tell you when something needs to be held in a separate bank account. Chris Sweet points out that North Attleboro now has an appointed treasurer collector. And let's see what else. Many municipalities are years behind on takings and subsequents. Are any laws being broken, and what do you recommend? I will answer that from the perspective of all of the things that Casey said, that you want to have consistent policies and procedures around tax takings and things like that. But more importantly, to your community, when you set your budget, you plan on collecting 100% of your real estate receivables, amounts that you've billed. When you don't, that impacts your free cash. Any real estate receivables not collected reduce your free cash. So for example, you have to think of it that, we planned that we would collect 100% of the tax revenue that we've billed. And when we don't, that puts us in a deficit on the revenue side. It doesn't put you in an overall deficit because maybe you have offsetting things on the other side, on the expense side. But what it does do is reduce your free cash.
I think to that point too, it's also, I think it's important when you're looking at your collections and your delinquent real estate, is the first thing is to dive into your, the balances. Are you having a drop of your revenue collection in recent years and you have a lot of recent tax titles that you should pursue foreclosure on or maybe look at issues with your revenue collection right now? Or is it that you have, a lot of 20 to 30-year-old tax titles that are accruing interest at a very high rate, and that's what's inflating your outstanding receivable in that way? On the note of older tax titles, I ran into issues where older tax titles were basically stuck because the tax taking was invalid. And it goes back to what we're talking about of being consistent with your process, with your timing, and also being diligent on making sure you're hitting the legal requirements. So I ran into issues where a tax taking, everything was done, all the notices, the demands, advertising, but the instrument of taking was not recorded within the 60-day requirement. So that created an issue with pursuing the tax title foreclosure in court, and it basically stagnated that tax title and left it as a growing outstanding receivable. So I think, there's one aspect of you have to dive into if you're inheriting a large outstanding receivable balance, you have to dive into that and see, what's creating that and what you can do to remedy that. But I think for moving forward, being consistent and making sure you're being diligent about hitting the legal requirements, especially with timing and advertisement, to prevent issues like that from coming up as you move forward.
The next question we have is, what is the order of what gets paid first when a taxpayer pays an overdue bill? Is it interest, fees, principal, water, sewer liens, betterments, etc.?
Interest and fees typically go first. Do you agree with that, Casey?
Yeah.
And then what is the rationale for requesting the assessor's office to commit abatements separately? For example, excise, motor vehicle excise, real estate, personal property, and vessel.
Could you repeat that question, Deb? Sorry.
What is the rationale for requesting the assessor's office to commit abatements separately? Maybe they mean the real estate receivable.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by separately.
Yeah, I guess I'm not either. Maybe the person asking the question can put some clarifying information in the question in the answer box. And then if after a real estate closing, the MLC is found to be inaccurate going against the town, is there any recourse to make a correction to collect real estate tax funds that were not corrected?
I would say that would be probably something for your town council to look at to see if there's any recourse available, because that does get tricky if you've had the MLC issued and it's incorrect. So I would say that would be something that your town council, if you have available to you, would be a great help in that aspect.
If it was the opposite way, where the customer overpaid or the taxpayer overpaid, then you must refund them.
Those are all the questions in the chat. Does anybody have anything else? Let me see. So Linda Smith says, you stated interest and fees first. Where do the other items fit in terms of paying a late bill? What about betterments and liens for water and sewer and that kind of thing fit into the hierarchy of payment?
Yeah, before the principal portion.
Okay. Do assessors or collectors issue supplemental bills?
In my experience, supplemental billing, obviously it's the supplemental billing is committed by the assessors, just like a regular commitment is committed to, from the assessors to the collectors to collect on. But I know that it's a very time-consuming process, and I'm sure BLA could speak to that. So, the process I believe mirrors, that of a regular commitment in terms of requirements and, the process of who's generating the bill and then committing it to collections. But I know it can be very time consuming, very complicated if a community is doing supplemental billing regularly.
The next question, do you have any best practice tips for the refund process on a double payment? Bank and owner.
Bank and owner. Well, I would say give yourself enough time to research payments before you're sending refunds out, because especially I'm sure people are aware that when you have large payments coming into your bank from escrow companies, there can unfortunately be errors on the bank side about maybe paying the wrong parcel, or maybe there's a lot that got separated and the payment went to a different parcel ID and things like that. So there are obviously instances that a bank pays and the resident pays, because maybe there's a miscommunication what's happening with their escrow versus what they have to pay themselves. So those things do happen. I would just say, because you also have other things happening with escrow payments and things coming from banks, and errors can be happening on the banking side. Before you do your refunds, you want to make sure you have enough research availability to do research of best practice. And I think it would just be giving yourself enough time to do the research before you send a refund payment, and then maybe schedule certain times. If it's a double payment on the third quarter, then it might fix itself by there's going to be no payment on the fourth quarter, either from the bank or the resident or the taxpayer. But obviously, if it's a fourth quarter double payment, then you want to do your end of year. Okay, we know all the payments collected and the overpayments, and send those out. So I would just say give yourself enough time, and also be aware of the timing of the year, because again, sometimes those things fix themselves when the next payment is due.
So there's a clarifying question to the earlier one about processing real estate, personal property, motor vehicle, and vessel separately. So she says, previously I would process real estate, personal property together at once, or motor vehicle, excise, and vessel. Now the tax collector requests them to be processed separately. I'm wondering why.
I would say it's much cleaner that way.
And it might be easier. I think, again, that's just something that's internally, it's what works for your offices. I'm thinking about maybe computer software. It might be easier to pull up the same bill type, because you can specify the category instead of, you can specify just real estate or just motor vehicle as a bill category. So it might be something like that, where it's just easier for processing purposes. But again, I think that's important for you guys to just communicate internally of what's working for your office, because again, it might be just something that's easier to do in the computer.
The next question, can a tax title lien be affected if the statutory 5-year period has expired, even though the property has not had a transfer of ownership? I
would plug our tax title webinar. And there's an excellent section. I believe Jim Crowley is the speaker of that section, that he goes into depth about the statutory timings and requirements. So I will plug our different webinar for that one.
And we can put that link, send that link out as well. How do other municipalities handle returned real estate and motor vehicle bills?
We used to put them in a separate pile and do additional research on that. Maybe the person has another home in the town. We try to find them that way. A lot of times it actually worked, where we were able to find the particular taxpayers.
If a sewer betterment is about to expire and the improvements have not been made yet, can the collector do a taking or add subsequence for the expiring betterment?
So is the betterment, I'm assuming on the real estate and it's unpaid, I would assume?
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, because my understanding, once there's a lien, water sewer, when they're liened onto the real estate, that's becoming unpaid real estate. So collector has the authority for any unpaid real estate to move it into tax title. So I would say that would be part of the tax taking process and securing the lien to the town that way.
This is a question, it might be a system question. If you mail fourth quarter bills separately, can you suppress mailing credit balance bills on the fourth quarter, giving you more time to research the credit balances, assuming your third quarter mailing have the full 2 quarter actual assessments on them? It sounds like it could be a system specific, depending what you're.
So I'm assuming, just so I understand, the bills are mailing and you're talking about the balances shown on the account with the system. Yeah, I would say that you would want to look into you're correct, Deb. I would say you want to look into your system capabilities to see that. I would just suggest that if you are changing anything on your regular bill format, be very diligent in checking that over before any bills mail, just to make sure that that nothing else in the format change and you're still complying with the bill form that we mentioned earlier, the commissioner's form.
The next question is, are there licensing or certification requirements for collectors?
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Typically, there's certification requirements from the Mass Treasurer Collector Association. And your town, will require that you receive a certification from them.
Yeah, so the requirement for Mass General law is depending on being bonded. That's the Mass General. If you're thinking Mass General law, it's really the ability in your surety bond. In terms of certification, like Dave's saying, I believe that's depending on your community. If that's if you're appointed position, that's somewhere in your contract that you must be certified or certified within some number of years. That would be a policy choice by your individual community.
Some of the questions get into pretty specific scenarios, and I think we're going to pass over those. And I would suggest you can reach out to either us directly or to your city or town council for some of these. So if someone is in tax title and we have a refund for them for an overpayment of excise, can we keep and put it toward what they owe us for real estate? So if somebody makes an overpayment on, say, motor vehicle, and they owe you have an outstanding balance for real estate, can you take the excess and apply it to another bill?
I would have to get back to you on that one. I believe there is something that you could take it and apply it somewhere else, but I would have to find the specific Mass General law. I don't want to say yes automatically. I would have to figure out what section. I think there is something that could allow you to do that, but again, I would have to double check.
And another question is similar. If refunds exist, but they owe back water payments, can we legally take the refund money and apply it? So that's probably the same answer. Is there a time? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, we can get back to you on that answer. But again, if you do have the ability, the authority to do that, I would just make sure that your record keeping is very diligent, because obviously, even if that person owes on another bill, they're still going to be waiting for their refund check or expecting a refund for the overpayment on a different bill type. So, if you are allowed to do that, I would just say be very diligent in your record keeping, so that inevitably when that person comes looking for their refund, you have a very clear and accurate record of what money was applied to where.
The next question is, there is a time limitation for tax collectors to complete an MLC. Is there any time guidance for providing data to requests about tax status?
I'm not aware of any requirement. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I would just be, it goes back to, again, the time of year. So obviously, obviously you have a lot of banks contacting you certain times of year, trying to understand what they need to submit for escrow payments. So obviously you can't, respond to everything that second as soon as you get them in, but I would try to be aware and maybe prepare for those certain times of years of making sure staff are available to answer those questions. I know it's not convenient time to always be answering the phone or the email, especially if you're having multiple questions on the same property. But I think trying to get ahead of that game prevents the issue, because at the end of the day, even if there's no requirement to respond to that in a certain number of time, obviously responding to it before an escrow payment is submitted or bank money is transferred will prevent some of the other issues we talked about of double payments or overpayments and having to do refund processes. So I would just say, expect those unsavory times of the year and just try and make sure you have the staff and availability to prepare for that flood of inquiries.
There's only 3 more questions, and so we'll just go through those quickly. What do other cities and towns do with their penny balances? Like if there's a very small.
As a collector, you have the ability to waive up to $15. So I would exercise that in terms of very small balances.
Are we required by law to resend any returned tax bills? It's a smaller office with limited staff and a limited postage budget. What's the requirement for resending returned tax bills?
I'm not sure what the requirement by law is, but I would always hang on to them. If we couldn't find the particular person. And once we did find them, we'd say, here's your actual bill. We sent it to this particular address.
Okay. And then finally, is there a Mass General law that places the ownership on the taxpayer for making sure that their payment is received for excise boat real estate tax bills?
Excise boat. So I'm assuming this is probably a scenario where someone says they submitted a payment, but it was lost in the mail. I don't know what part of Mass General law we could reference that. Obviously, I think it comes back down to the receipt. And if, obviously if they don't have a receipt for the payment, they don't have proof that it was actually paid. Obviously you want to try to be working with the customer when it comes in, because things do happen, things go, sideways, things can occur. But I would just, in those scenarios, I would always try to encourage a different payment method. If I knew that this, if this person was upset, if they mailed something, it got lost in the mail, as we all know that happened a lot with COVID, with the mail being crazy or being late. So I would say in those areas, if you have the ability to promote maybe some online payment system that you have, or direct payment that has a better trail and timing method and timing associated with it, I would try and encourage that. But I mean, ultimately, if someone says they sent in a payment, but you don't have a receipt of the payment, there's no obligation, obviously, to just believe what they're saying. Unfortunately, it goes by receipt and what you have on your records.
Well, that was the last question. Those were a lot of really good questions, and we thank you all for joining us and asking those questions. Jen, did you want to wrap it up?
Sure. I think we can wrap it up, and we will be sharing the recording and the presentation, which will have the citations to the general law, and we will also make sure we share any links that were shared, including like the link to the treasurer and different things, other webinars and tax taking webinars we had. So we will send a comprehensive email later this week, early next week, and we appreciate you joining us today. And thank you to Casey, Deb, and Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Deb.
everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.